Hey Roosters, and welcome back to another episode of Making My Own TCG. In today's episode, we're going to be going over the game flow of the game, so basically how turn structure will be, and pretty much some rough rules for the game, so that we can start playtesting in the next episode. Let's dig right in. Now, if you didn't watch episode 1, 2, and 3, I very much suggest you go and do so. But as a quick summary, in episode 1, we came up with a core idea for the game. In episode 2, we defined those mechanics even further so we knew what we were going for. In episode 3, we created a combat system. And now with this episode, we're going to be creating a basic turn structure and essentially rules for the game. And although that doesn't seem like we've decided much about our card game, before we go into place testing in the next video, but once you realize that after you start play testing, then a lot of the things you decided about your card game may end up going out the window, whether it's because they're just not fun ideas or concepts, they just don't work, or they don't work the way you thought they were going to work and you realize you want to do something else entirely. Once playtesting starts, a lot of the ideas that you came up with sort of have to be changed, and you probably are going to want them to be changed. So starting off and making up a bunch of different things for the card game, and defining it down to the most minute detail, creating all these cards before you even started playtesting is ultimately only going to make work harder when you decide what changes need to be made. And you will decide changes need to be made. Let's talk about a deck within this card game, right? So in this card game, you're obviously going to have a couple cards in your deck and a character card. That's stuff that I probably talked about in the previous videos, and you probably gathered already if I didn't outright state it. But there's a couple changes I want to make to the game when I'm talking about decks right now, and there's two specific changes that I didn't at all mention in previous videos that I think is probably ultimately going to help this card game in a big way. So aside from your character card, which you're going to have to choose one before you start deck building probably, because it's going to decide exactly a lot about how you want to build your deck. You're going to have a deck that's probably going to have a minimum of 40 cards, maximum of 60, but I'm not really sure. Obviously, deck building and whatnot, playtesting and whatnot is going to change my mind on a lot of things, but I think that's a pretty good way to start when you're designing your card game. No more than 3 copies of any one card in a deck. That's pretty standard. But then we're also going to have a separate side of your character card. Now, I'm not sure the Game Crafter, which is probably where I'm going to end up making these cards, has the ability to do double-sided cards. So if it doesn't, then you're probably going to have 2 cards. One's going to be your base character card, and one's going to be its evolution that you can evolve into during the game. And then also, we're going to have probably a small deck of cards, of maybe 4 cards, maybe, that are going to end up being your habitat cards, so to speak. And I talked about having a board in the game a lot, and I wanted the board to represent a lot of things to the game. And then I decided, you know what? Maybe it's smarter not to have a board, not to make people have to bring something to physically represent where they are on the map, especially because I want this board to be small. It's not going to be huge, you're not going to be traversing and exploring. It's going to be a relatively small board, but it also needs to be big enough to house all the players. So if every player brings their own cards, and your cards make up the board, and like I said, you're not going to have cards on top of this board. You're probably going to have some small, different little, maybe miniatures, not miniatures, but like small little representations of yourself on this board. So it's not going to become too cluttered or become too hard to traverse this board. Then we can make the board up out of cards, out of these habitat cards you're going to bring with you to the game, and every player can add some to the habitat, the overall board of the game, which means that if there's more players, the board will naturally become bigger. If there's less players, then the board will naturally become smaller. And I think that's a really great way to do it for this game, especially with one of my biggest problems with adding a board to the game was the fact that I don't want the board to become too big, and like the players aren't really interacting at all while traversing across this board. So I think that's pretty cool, and I think those are some changes that I felt like I need to mention now. Though of course I'll talk a little bit more about them when I go into playing the game actually, or at least the rough version of it. So let's say you have a deck now and you want to set up the game. Well, that's going to be simple. You need to place your deck somewhere. Now obviously it doesn't really matter where, though a lot of games like to specify certain places they want you to place your deck. So you place your deck, your discard pile will need to be placed somewhere around it, right? Ideally, you're going to need to have a lot of counters for this game. You're going to need something to track your stamina, and you're probably going to need something to track your light and dark energy, right? So those two things need to be acquired. Other than that, you're also probably going to need one more counter for the monster mechanic that I create for the game. In which case, you're going to need some way to count your mutation value, which is going to be how much of how much mutagen your monsters, your characters collecting or sort of gaining before they transform to their monster form. It's going to make a lot more sense when I get to playtesting, or maybe it will not make any sense. It'll have to be completely removed. But yeah, characters are going to have a monster form they can transform into, and you're going to sort of have to build that up throughout the game. So let's say the game's officially started. You have your deck, you have your discard pile, you have your habitat deck, you have your character and your monster card on the field, right? You guys are ready to play. So what do you guys need to do first? So I think the first thing that is going to end up happening is players are going to have to create the board for the game, right? The board that they're going to traverse. And so I think that each player in the game will add 2 cards to the total board from their habitat deck. Now the question is whether the cards from the habitat deck will be random or will be chosen. If they're chosen, obviously be a lot more strategic because you'll be able to see what your opponent is playing and try to make the board to fit you and not them. Then of course if it's random, it can add a lot more excitement to the game and a lot more, well, I have this one water habitat in my deck because it works sort of well with my game plan, but at the same time I know my opponent wants to use water habitats naturally. So the question is, do I play it or not? But if it's random, then it might be, oh wow, it popped up. I gotta deal with it somehow. Obviously, you're still gonna be able to construct your habitat deck. It's not gonna be all bad cards for you, but it could be pretty interesting to do it either way. Obviously, I'd like it to be chosen so a little more strategy can be put into the game, especially when your opponent's going to be able to choose their own 2. It's not going to be like you're going to have a full say on what's going on the board. But of course, 2 cards from each player will be added to create the field, and everybody's going to place one of their little not miniatures. I keep saying miniatures, but I don't think that's going to even be necessary. But a marker for themselves. A marker is a great way to say it. You're going to put their character marker on somewhere on the board to start off the game. After that, players are going to probably shuffle up their actual decks and draw 5 cards, right? And I think 5 cards is a perfect starting card hand size for any game, especially in a game like this, where it's not gonna you're not gonna need a wide option of cards since your deck is going to be mostly one type of card. So then we're probably gonna have a mulligan system, right? And I love mulligan systems, and I like when they're done a certain way. So it's just the perfect way, in my personal opinion, to do mulligan is that you set the cards you don't want aside, you draw new cards, and then you shuffle the ones you set aside back in, not put at the bottom, not discard. And I think that's the perfect way to do a mulligan. Obviously, I think a lot of people do mulligans other ways. Some probably better than mine, but also some probably worse. Simply to make now mulligans not too powerful. But I don't think mulligans will ever end up being too powerful, being the fact that the deck is always going to be random. Right? Okay, so you take your mulligan. Now you have to decide who goes first. Probably coin flip, rock, paper, scissors. It's not probably going to matter to me. So however you decide that you're going first, the game can start. And once the game starts, we get right into the turn flow of the game, which is going to be very simple, but ultimately a lot of decisions need to be made from the very beginning. In the previous video, I talked about the combat system, and I talked a lot about how the game's going to work Gameflow-wise, sort of how the turn structure is going to be. And the short answer for that is there really wasn't going to be one. So your turn, in quotations, air quotes, you're going to have a main action and a side action. And there's different cards that call you to make one of these actions, and there's base actions you can do with these actions, your main and your side, that you're going to choose to do. You're going to do something with your main action, you're going to choose to do something with your side action. And once you're done with that, it's your opponent's turn to do the same. And you're going to go back and forth like this for the entire game. The thing is that a lot of games that have action systems like this, like Ashes Reborn, like Star Wars Destiny, or Star Wars Unlimited that's coming out right now, the way you go back and forth and eventually there's a breakpoint. Both players run out of gas, they run out of resources, the game lets them reset, to let them build up more, to let them get back into the fight, potentially, right? But for our game, we don't really want that to be happening. The break between action is going to be when you're traversing the board. When you engage a fighter, that's going to be the real start of a battle, right? So we don't need that break. Not to mention, the whole point of this game is that you don't regain health. Your resources don't return to you. You have to manage them throughout the game. Unless, of course, you die, which I talked about I believe I talked about that in the second episode, but it might have been the third. But the point is that when you die, then you're going to gain more resources. So you're going to have 3 lives throughout the game. And of course, you're probably going to have to, now that I think about it, you're probably going to need a way to track your 3 lives. So that's another thing you're probably going to end up needing to track. But of course, it's only 3 coins. A simple D6 will do. It's not too hard. A paper pencil will do because it's just 3 lives you need to track somehow, right? Easy. You probably could remember it too. It's only 3. Anyway, point is, After you die, that's when you're going to regain some stamina back to your stated amount. And you're going to be able to get back into the fight. You'll be able to move around the board some more and replan and upgrade your character and stuff like this. So you're going to get a chance to do a lot of the things that would probably happen if there was a break between the action phases. But because of that, we don't really need one. So it's going to be main action, side action, main action, side action, and it's going to be really important what I decide can be used as a base main action or base side action, because that's really going to determine how easy it is going to be to play the game without those breaks. Because a lot of times those breaks allow you to draw a card, gain resources, stuff like that. So we're going to need to talk about the main and the side actions and what they're actually going to be capable of without any other card effects being involved. To start off, both main and side actions can be used to draw cards. In the previous video, I believe I put on the screen rather, that I was really wondering whether I wanted one or the other to be able to draw you cards. But I really came to the conclusion that both should be able to do that. The fact that there's no break in turns in which you can draw cards as a player, that means the card flow is going to be really tight, and having the ability at any time during your action phase to say, okay, well, I don't really have anything to do, I'm going to take a break here, draw 2 cards. Obviously, that may make up some disparities, but obviously the disparities will probably end up being created by you, the player. Unless your opponent is playing a really disruptive deck where they discard a lot of cards in their hands, which I guess I'll have to mitigate within playtesting. It's going to be up to you, the player, when you're going to get those cards that you need and when you're going to start fishing. And the ability to say, hey, I need to fish for 2 right now is going to be really powerful. And your opponent can do the same, obviously, or you can say, hey, I'm going to do one thing, I'm going to fish for 1, I'm going to do something else, and I'm going to draw 1 card, right? So I think both the side and the main action having the ability to draw you cards is very important. So from there on, let's talk about some of the things your main action can get you. So your main action, at least when you're out of combat, can move you across the board. I was going to make this a side action ability, but I decided it's probably going to be better to be a main action ability. Another main action you can do during outside of combat is to try to conquer some land. And now conquering land is something I talked about in the previous video, and I didn't really have a great idea for how it's going to work, but with cards involved, I can make certain values on the card that is going to decide how easy it, whether what's going to happen when you conquer that land. It's going to be a lot easier to say that I conquered this piece of land because it's a singular card on the board, right? So that's probably what's going to end up happening. You can conquer land with one of your main actions, right? So then, what else can you do with the main action? Well, when you're in combat with the main action, you can play an attack card, and that's a very big distinction. Not any card is going to be a main action. I think the only type of cards that are going to be main actions are attack cards, which you can only play during combat. So you can play an attack card as your main action. So if you want to attack somebody during your turn, it's going to take your main action from you. But really, that's the only thing main actions really do during combat, is attacking. Or drawing cards, technically. Okay, so from there on, what are the side actions? What are some of the things side actions can do? So, first off, I want you to be able to expend energy. I talked about in the first video that you're going to have 2 types of energy, or the second video you're going to have 2 types of energy, in the third video that side actions can expend that energy. So you can take a side action to expend some energy. Obviously, you can take some to draw some cards, and then of course, I want you to be able to use a side action to play other types of cards. You can play an action card with a side action, and you can play an upgrade card with a side action. Not attack cards, though. That's a very important distinction to make. But other than that, I think those are some good base things you can do with your main and side actions, both within and outside of combat. And so obviously that should be something to remember, because it's going to be really important to the game. I just realized that I never mentioned exactly how you mutate into your mutation form, and it's very simple. Throughout the game, you're going to have different card effects, and maybe some effects on your character that's going to gain you mutate counters. When you gain a certain amount, probably going to be 6, though I may just make it so that every character has a certain amount that they need to mutate. And then you're going to mutate into your mutate form, which is going to make you more powerful, give you more stats and stuff like that. Though I'm also playing with the idea and the concept that maybe your mutate form won't always be a positive, and it may be in some cases something that you may or may not want to transform into, depending on the playstyle you're going for. Maybe it will make you lose control of how your gameplay is going to end up being, make things more random, but get more risk and reward type thing. I'm playing with that idea because I think it would be pretty cool to, when you beast out, you become uncontrollable. That being said, it's very simple and it's very straightforward, and it might end up being dropped, being the fact that it may not even be needed, or may just add more complexity to the game that it doesn't really need. But I think it's also a pretty cool concept to dive into. And when I go over the lore of the game, I think it will be something that it will lend well to lore. At this point, we talked a lot about combat, but the question is, how do we get into combat? How do we get to the point in which we actually get to do what we want to do? Great question. So, to start off, you're going to be in the same space as your opponent, the person you're trying to attack and trying to enter combat with. So, obviously, although we both move one space, probably you can only move one space during your turn. So if I move closer to you, you can move further away from me. But the thing is that the further you move, the more you move, the more I can move. Eventually, somebody's going to decide to stop to whether to conquer some land because that's going to take your main action, or reduce, or to yeah, you're going to try. You're probably going to have to stop to try to conquer some land, which means that your opponent can gain on you, right? So, or if you stop, your opponent can stop, right? But the question is, are we going to keep running around in circles forever when there are going to be cards in the game that allow you to move an extra step? Right, so remember card move one. So you get to move one during your main phase. You get to play an action card with a side with your main action. You move one. You play a card with your side action to move another one. You just move two. Well, now your opponent is usually going to be hitting you right in the face. It's gonna be a lot harder to run away. And maybe if it's not, then you can keep doing that. And so eventually, you're going to catch up to your opponent. And anytime two players share the same space on the board, they have to fight in combat, mortal combat, to the death, to be exact, until you respawn and you just lose life. Point is, you're going to have to fight. That's when combat starts. I talked about combat a lot in my last video. I'm not going to go over it again in this video. If you didn't watch episode 3, go watch episode 3. It talks all about attacking and blocking. But the footnotes are, once combat starts, it doesn't end until one player loses all their stamina and loses a life. And then you're going to be able to run around the board again and try to rebuild up your character, not rebuild up your character, but build up your character some more and hopefully conquer more land, stuff like that. And that's all there's really going to be for the game. That's basically the entire game flow, entire roots and footnotes. And that's everything you really need to know to play the game, essentially. You play cards, pay their cost, you move around the board, you conquer land, you enter into combat. Everything you did up until that point is supposed to help you into beating your opponent in combat. And they get to die, and then they come back, and then you have to do that again and again and again until one player loses all their lives. It may seem a little bit repetitive when there's just two players, but obviously once there gets on to 3 players, 4 players, maybe 5, 6, I don't know how many games, how many players it's really going to be able to hold, but once you start building up the amount of players, which is sort of what I want this game to be, a battle royale type game, once there's more players on the field, it's going to get a lot crazier because there's a lot more people running around, a lot more different people to interact with, bump into, start fighting, right? There's a lot more land to capture, land to conquer, different lands to watch out for, hazards maybe, hazardous lands that may be hazardous to certain cards, characters, but not hazardous to others. I don't know. Point is, you can get a lot more crazy once you add a lot more people into the mix, and I think it's going to be a lot more fun. That being said, we're going to test out how fun it's actually going to be in the next video. Stay tuned to episode 5 of Making My Own TCG, in which we finally start playtesting this amazing new card game.